Good evening, folks. This is The Weird Part, and I am your host, Vincent Treewell. This evening, I have a very special guest, Elder David August from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, Strangite. Welcome, Elder.
Thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Yes, my pleasure. When I think a lot of people who are not in the Mormon faith think of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, they think of Salt Lake City and assume that the church and the movement around it were founded there. That, of course, is completely untrue. What can you tell our listeners about the origin of early Mormonism and the prophet Joseph Smith in upstate New York?
Well, I think the earliest days of the church started in the early 1800s, but I think to understand it, you kind of have to go back quite a ways, and I'll try to really condense that. Following the crucifixion of Christ, we all know the apostles took over the church for many decades, and Paul had a ministry to the Gentile people and brought in and started many new churches. And as we see secular history progressing from that point, and we look at the fact that all those early apostles and all spoke of a warning that in the future things were going to change, that people would come in and change a lot of things about the true Christian ideal and the true identities of certain things, that it would change it. There'd be myths and stuff brought in to replace it. Many warnings, if you read them in there, that they're saying these things are going to happen. In fact, they said they were even starting to happen in their own time. And we also understand that in the very earliest church, it was really dominated by a Jewish contingency. Those were the earliest converts. But with the advent of Paul's ministry, we see eventually, we hear, as we get into the second and third centuries, we hear very little about a Jewish contingency. Most of the churches are all established in Gentile communities, and they are, in fact, converted pagan Gentiles. And that's where a lot of these changes and mythologies start to evolve. And they really don't come to a head until we actually see the church joining forces with the Roman Empire when Constantine adopts the Christian faith as the state faith. Now, he himself did not convert at the time, and he himself, I don't think, actually was a follower of the faith at the time. But still, the church couldn't resist the temptation to legitimize itself and find power, the state-enforced power, when they were used to being persecuted in the centuries prior. So it's understandable how they might do it, but as a Christian, is that what Christ would have done? Would he have joined forces with Constantine, the emperor of the Roman Empire? And of course, now, from that point on, we see huge changes take place. The church literally is not this grassroots organization of simply spreading this message of who Jesus is and his atonement and that he's the savior. We see it evolve into a governing body, an army body, wars, rumors of wars. I mean, we see a completely different organization. And as history goes on, it only gets worse. We have inquisitions. We have the Crusades. You know, these things have nothing in common whatsoever with the message Jesus brought forth. And yet that became the only sole representative of Christianity. And even when we get into the later years with the reformers, they basically, almost all of them were at one time Catholic, because that was the only really religion at the time. And so they saw things that were wrong, and they were extremely brave and courageous people that actually objected to these things. They paid for it with their life, but they only changed a few things, and they might have separated themselves, but they took with it most of the thoughts and processes, the creed of Saint Athanasius, all these different things that became the hallmark of Christianity, the Trinity doctrines, all these different things were formulated, but they took it with them. So even those reformers many times would comment, we are changing certain things, but there has to be a restoration of the original church at some point. They never claimed to have restored the original church. They reformed what they saw as wrong with the church. And so as we no sooner get through that period of time, when the early forms of Mormonism start in a very simple way that you would never really imagine. A 14-year-old boy, Joseph Smith. It's a time of a great deal of interest in religion, and there's a lot of camp meetings and proselyting going on. And he is confused and he doesn't know who to join. So he goes out and he reads in the Bible where it says, if you lack wisdom, you pray to God and he'll answer you. Being young and naive, he just goes out and does that. And at that point, God and Jesus appear to him and tell him that he's not supposed to join any of them, that he has a work to do, that he is to restore back the original priesthoods and a lot of the original ideas. And that,
if I may, because his prayer was, tell me which church to join.
He had asked, which of all these should I join? And he was told none of them, that none of them were really what he was supposed to do. And so that's really where it started. And from there, of course, he was persecuted almost immediately. And later, it's actually several years that before he actually organizes the church. He's just 14 years old at the time. And he's visited regularly over the next few years by an angel, which instructs him and shows him where there is an ancient record that he is supposed to, when he is ready, he can dig it up and translate it. And that takes quite a few years until finally he's allowed to do it. That is the advent of the Book of Mormon, which is just a record of an ancient people from our continent here that had received a visitation from Jesus right after his death. And if some indication to back that idea up was when Jesus is talking to his apostles, he leaves them, he says, other sheep have I not of this fold. They too will hear my voice. It's one of his last things he says before he ascends back into heaven. And we believe, Joseph believes, and we believe, that's where he went. He went and visited them. They were a group of Israelite-based people that had migrated to this continent, which was not impossible. More and more discoveries show that people were migrating to this continent from all over the world, very early.
Oh, yes.
And so it's not like, oh, that's ridiculous that Columbus discovered America.
We've covered actually on this show that there are many contacts from the so-called old world to the Americas. Absolutely.
Got it. So that's the nutshell beginnings of Mormonism. And the church starts out from that point. It's very small, but it grows relatively quickly into a pretty good, big, large group of people comparatively. But it's persecuted at almost every step that it takes. And especially initially, right away, Joseph doesn't get, he's drug out of his home and tarred and feathered in the middle of winter. And just people trying to find the gold plates, they hear about them, so they're trying to steal them and rob them from them, and they're always running. But that's kind of the earliest stories of Mormonism that all Mormons have in common, you might say, is that era with Joseph Smith.
I don't think most Americans know how harshly the Mormons were persecuted purely on religious grounds, throwing the First Amendment out the window, and were really subject to a lot of violence and campaigns of terror. I don't think people are unaware.
Not really. I think that they probably don't know about the early persecution. Some of the later things that happened in Utah are more well known because they've been made into movies or different things, but some of that was completely not related to the early days. But I think it is kind of odd when I think about it in America, where we were supposed to have religious freedom, that late in our development, we still had one religious group that was being persecuted by people wherever they went. And it's not that they were the only group, because early on in this country, the Puritans and others, they persecuted Quakers, and there was a lot of that going on here. But by the time we get into the 1800s and mid 1800s, it does seem a bit out of place. But I think, having studied Mormon history from a lot of angles with a lot of historical colleagues that are really great historians, it does start to, you learn so many different reasons how this might have happened. There were certain contributing factors that included economic factors, and also factors concerning slavery. Mormons were abolitionists, and when you go into a slave state like Missouri, you are not popular, especially when you can vote. And this was at a time when Missouri was being tore apart by that question. And so that, and other factors too, that even some of the Mormons themselves helped hasten some of that opposition too, because they were too vocal about themselves and kind of trying to push around a little bit. So you got to look at a lot of different aspects to understand it. But as a whole, it's still hard to conceive that there was that big of a problem about it.
I read an excellent book a few years ago. You may have heard of it, American Crucifixion, and it was about the murder of the prophet Joseph Smith. And people don't often know a whole lot about that, and it was very impressive.
I think most Americans look at it like anything else that they consume off of hearsay, bad information. Yeah, he was a bad guy and he finally got what he deserved or something. That would be the general idea. But really, it's far from the truth, and it's also difficult for people to understand why some people wanted him dead so badly, unless you really do go back into history and understand more about it, and what they didn't like about the Mormons and stuff, which really it was not always about their religion. It was a lot of it was sour over the Missouri experience, because there was fights there and persecutions and stuff back and forth, and the government from Missouri didn't want to let that slide. They just they were going to come into Illinois if they had to, but they were going to do something about it. There was some vengeance involved with that, I'm sure. But for the most part, I think it's kind of a sad chapter in American history.
Yes, ending with a lynch mob killing. It's terrible.
Yeah.
Yes. Let me see here. After the assassination of the prophet Joseph Smith, there was a crisis of succession. What could you describe? What could you tell us about that?
Well, the first thing I would tell you about that is that the term crisis of succession should not apply at all, because the fact of the matter is, as early on in the church in 1831, that is like 13 years before Joseph Smith is killed, he receives a revelation that is extremely specific to the idea that if he is taken, he will have the power to appoint another in his stead. Even if, not like he's going to come from the dead, but before he's taken, he will appoint a successor. It's so clear. And the revelation is so clear and definite that it says I'm going to reiterate. I'm going to tell you this again because it's so important so that you're not deceived when it happens. So this is a law to the church, he says. This is a law that you have to follow. And when Joseph is taken, trust, he will appoint a successor. Section 43 of the D&C. So this should clear up any succession difficulties, right?
That's the Doctrines and Covenants for listeners who might not be aware.
And it's a revelation given to Joseph by Christ. And he says, and it's been there. So when he is taken, in fact, for the most part, people are saying there's a lot of documentation of the idea that they were saying, look, we don't know who the head of the church is. Sidney Rigdon was the second in command, so he was supposed to take charge in the interim. They didn't really let him do that. But it goes up to the 12 apostles are saying, well, we have to wait till all the 12 get back to Nauvoo. Joseph has left some sealed documents with instructions, blah, blah, blah. And some were hinting that it might be his son. So others didn't know. But they had to wait until he came back, until all the apostles came back and they could sit down and open these sealed documents. A person who was a secretary to Joseph Smith and pretty high up in the church, John P. Green, he was telling people, yeah, I was there. He wrote a letter to this guy in Wisconsin, and don't worry about it. You know, it's going to be taken care of. John P. Green lived 2 more weeks after that statement, and so and the funny thing is, from that point forward, we never hear anything about sealed documents again.
I see.
Never a word. Nothing ever comes of it. The 12 apostles come back, basically get rid of Sidney Rigdon as possibly being a guy to take over. They say, the only person that claimed to have received something from Joseph Smith that appointed him was James A. Strang. The only one. It's not like we got 5 guys all claiming this.
And that's something else I wanted to ask you. There weren't multiple claimants competing. There was only one person, and that was James J. Strang, coming forward and having a document and having even making the assertion that I am the next right. prophet.
It would have been more difficult to decipher had 12 people shown up with, he sent me a letter, or he came and talked to me, and I got 5 witnesses that he ordained me to be his successor. Mm-hmm. No, the 12 apostles assumed control of the church simply based on the fact that they could, not because they had a right to, but more because most of the converts in Nauvoo were fresh immigrants from England. A lot of the earlier converts still lived in the East. A lot of the Nauvoo people, they came from England, they went straight to Nauvoo. And the people who had converted them in England was primarily led by Brigham Young. So he kind of had a controlling consensus of a lot of people in Nauvoo, but they may be over here for months, Mm-hmm. And if he says we shouldn't listen to James A. Strang, or he says we shouldn't listen to anybody else that says this, they're pretty much going to go along with that, yes. Because they don't know.
Much more of a power grab than a actual issue of succession.
And for quite a few years, Brigham Young claims that no one will ever take Joseph's place. That he basically going completely against Section 43 and saying that no one will be appointed prophet of the church, that he's not the prophet of the church. But then within 2 years later, then he claims he is the prophet of the church, mm-hmm. and kind of because people say he is. Mm-hmm. And so it's not exactly, it's a pretty shaky ground. And I think that's one of the great things about, you talk about interesting histories. Well, obviously the Mormon church grew quite large under his tutelage in Salt Lake and stuff. But it really kind of has this skeleton in the closet, as to what it took to justify that particular act, and the fact that the letter of appointment. I mean, they just told people, oh, that's a fake. Well, if you have time, I'll just mention.
Do tell, please.
The letter of appointment was mailed from Nauvoo on June 19th. Joseph Smith is assassinated June 27th. The letter arrives in Burlington on July 9th. So it was literally in the process, in the mail, when he is assassinated. So the idea that James A. Strang just suddenly made this up because, oh, Joseph is dead. I got a letter from him. No, I mean, he didn't even know.
News would not have traveled like that at all.
Right,
yeah.
Right. It's like this all happened in such a way that it's very difficult to have claimed that this letter, because the timing's all wrong. The letter was sent at a time, and they had checked it at first. They showed the ledger at Nauvoo that they did see the letter, and it went to Chicago, and then it went to Burlington, because they always used to write down in the ledger every letter, so it was registered. But then a few months later, some of the people who were Strangite followers went to Nauvoo to argue their point that James should be the leader of the church. But when they went to the post office to prove that the ledger said the letter was sent, it was all there except for that week, and it was gone.
Very coincidentally, that's the only documentation missing. Yes.
Still missing to this day. But however, the proof is still, because the register in Chicago still exists, showing the letter coming from Nauvoo to Chicago and being forwarded to Burlington. So it really didn't work. It just, at the time, it worked because they couldn't prove it to the group in Nauvoo at the time that it had been sent. So that's a lot of pretty crazy stuff around how the church, how the whole succession crisis. We didn't call it a crisis. They called it a succession crisis because they couldn't come up with a true heir to Joseph Smith's position. So
kind of a coup took place, you might say.
In some ways,
larger church.
Not so much of a coup because they didn't overthrow Joseph, but they kind of hijacked, you might say. And I don't want to sound really precocious about, because I have a lot of friends that are Utah Mormons and stuff, and they're a wonderful group of people. So I try not to talk bad about it, because those people didn't do it.
Oh, absolutely. Yes.
I'm saying the people who at that day and time in that position, and I'll say this as my best defense of what they did. I'm sure that in many ways, Brigham Young thought this would be the best thing for the church. They were under a lot of pressure. The people around them were attacking them. They were trying to run him out of Illinois. He's got all these people. What are we going to do? And the idea that we're going to trust some guy that joined the church just 4 months before this, and we're going to trust him to lead us, that's ludicrous. I'd be irresponsible if I let him take over the church. We don't know who he is. So he probably justified it some way, but it doesn't change the fact that it wasn't his to take, in many ways.
Yes.
And James really would have been a very capable leader, actually, and would have actually given the people immediate refuge here, where they, and that's really in the letter of appointment. That's what Joseph Smith said was revealed to him, that Joseph didn't pick him. He had met him and had Joseph Smith actually baptized James, and Joseph and Hiram both taught him for quite a while. He was with them, and they sent him back to Wisconsin to scout it out and report back to him, and he did. So it really wasn't a case. The letter itself is not really an appointment from Joseph Smith. it's Joseph Smith receiving instructions that that's who he is supposed to appoint. And that he says, and he's the one that coined the phrase Voree. He said, that's where they were, that settlement in the revelation to him was called Voree, and that's where the people would go, and that there they would be able to rest, and that the people there would show them kindness and would not persecute them. And that was in the revelation in the letter to James J. Strang. And so that
and Voree is a small town in Wisconsin that still exists and was going to be a safe haven.
Voree, the term Voree did not exist until it appeared in the letter of appointment from Joseph to James. It was called here. It was Burlington, city of Burlington, but the settlement here was called Voree. The stake of Zion that was established here was called Voree, but that wasn't James's name for it. That was Joseph Smith's revelation that's where they were to go. That stake was referred to as Voree. So,
okay. So I didn't realize, even having done some research, that that Strang had joined only 4 months earlier.
Yeah,
that's very interesting, because he had a storied career prior to that. Did he not?
Not in religious terms.
Oh, no, and he was a state legislator, I believe.
No, that comes later.
Oh, okay. I did not. Yeah. Okay, after. Okay, go ahead, please.
At this point, he is a lawyer, but just kind of a country lawyer. I think they used to be able to study on their own, and if they can go pass the test, you're a lawyer. So off you go.
No bar exam, no law license. You just.
I think it was a bar exam. He did have to pass some kind of an exam, but I think that was about it. And but no, the
same way Abraham Lincoln did, though. I mean, that was the way that was done. Yeah.
Similar.
So, at what point is there a settlement established in Burlington?
Yes, you're right. Just outside of Burlington on the White River was where the settlement was, and that's where we are right now. In fact, I live on in that very place. So, and it was just an area, probably 1,000 acres that you could but the actual whole thing actually could cover anything within a 2-county area around here. So that's, and some people did come up here, but not many. By far, the most of the people trekked out to Utah, and the people out east, the contingencies that were in from Kirtland and some of the other New York State people, Ohio people that were Mormons, they kind of stood pat. They kind of didn't go anywheres.
Defended in place, yes.
Yeah, and they didn't, and it was initially most of them supported James. They didn't particularly follow what Brigham Young was doing, maybe because of Section 43, maybe for other reasons, I don't know. I know one of the contributing things was that Brigham, I think there was a lot of talk of polygamy coming out of Nauvoo, and that Brigham Young was involved with that, and they were very anti-polygamy, as was James J. Strang. And so they didn't know him either, but if he was anti-polygamy, that's reason enough to say, well, we'll kind of stick with this guy for a while. But they still didn't move here to support him. They just stayed where they were, probably pretty comfortable, and didn't come out and do a whole lot. They just kind of stood back and observed, I think, for the most part.
Okay. How does Beaver Island come up? What happens that leads from Voree to Beaver Island and the things that happen there?
Well, Beaver Island comes about when James has a revelation about this being something that God wants to establish another stake there, because it's isolated, where they could really set up their community and live the way they want to live without a lot of interference or whatever. It's like, I'm sure that's what James's attraction was. here they were not persecuted by any outsiders here in Burlington or Voree, but they did have internal problems, which I think there were always some internal problems. I think people who would get dissatisfied with something, didn't like something that went on or was said. There was a troublemaker guy named Bennett that had turncoated on Joseph Smith and wrote a scathing report about him. And John C. Bennett was his name, and most Mormons hated him. Well, he shows up here in Voree and goes to James and says, "Look, I'm sorry. I've repented. I was wrong. I shouldn't have done that. I want to join with you." Well, James felt obligated that if the man says he's repented, I have to give him a chance, But this is a very unpopular decision because people really don't care for him. And this is about the time James is discovering or exploring Beaver Island and trying to purchase property up there and trying to do all that. And Bennett is back here basically making trouble. Because, back then you didn't really know what was going on back here. If you're gone for
communication is very different than that time.
You can find out what's happened. Well, he's back here making trouble. But he was only associated with him for about 8 months. Because when James finally comes back and kind of finds out what's going on, he kicks him out. But the damage had already been done. People had turned against James. Well, you let this guy in. We told you not to. So then those people always cause trouble. That's typical, I think, of groups back in that day and age. People weren't real, they were pretty headstrong, I think, in many ways. And but for the most part,
let me just, I don't want to interrupt you, but I guess I kind of jumped the gun there asking about Beaver Island because something very important happened in Voree before Beaver Island. And that was the plates that James J. Strang discovered.
Yeah.
Would you tell us about that?
Yeah, there's actually some misconception, perhaps. I was reading your question about the plates he found, and you were associating them to the Book of the Law. However, the Book of the Law...
Correct me where I'm incorrect, please.
Pardon?
I said, correct me where I'm incorrect, please.
The Book of the Law was not translated from the plates that were discovered here. Those plates were a bound section of the plates that Joseph received on the Book of Mormon. There was a sealed section that he had dug up in the Hill Cumorah and translated the Book of Mormon, but the other sealed section, the angel told him, is not for him to reveal. And he didn't. And so when Joseph was done with the translation, the angel actually came back and took everything back to heaven with him because they weren't going to be left on earth. They were too sacred and too much chance of them getting taken by people who were already trying to steal them all the time. And so they were taken back. Those plates were delivered to James by an angel, and said, here's the sealed section for you to translate. And that was the Book of the Law. The small plates that he found here were just a small little blurb of people who had inhabited this, that had been killed off in wars, and they left this record. And those are called the Voree plates. They're very small. They were dug up here. I won't get too much detail about it. James himself did not dig them up. He simply had a vision of where they were. And he got 5 guys from town, and he said, that oak tree about the size of a man, he said, you're going to dig down about 3.5 feet directly under the tree, and you'll find a stone box, and inside you'll find these plates. And he said, take special care to notice the ground, make a written record of how what you observe. And he left. And sure enough, exactly as he said, they dug them up, and there's the box, and there's the plates, and they make a testimony that and we could tell that they were old. The box kind of crumbled when it hit the air, and and there were roots that were wrapped around it from the oak tree. So it's not like somebody dug it up a couple weeks earlier and stuck them in there.
It wasn't something that could be planted like that. Yeah.
Yeah, they were like fastened to it, but they had to cut the roots away around it in order to get it out. They make, note of this in their report. And those are just two small plates that, again, speak about a group of people here but they were people who had an understanding of who God was, to a certain degree. And they just said that they're gone, but that someday there'll be these lands are sacred and will be possessed by a man of God, that they'll be here. And so they're pretty simple. A good friend of mine, John Hamer, who is a noted scholar and Mormon expert, was fascinated by that when he found out that there was actually we have a pictorial record of them. They had been kind of traced, all the different characters, and we have his translation. He's like, "Are you kidding? That never happens. We never have the ancient letters and this." And so he did a lot of research on it, and obviously it was a lost language, but some linguistic experts said that it does appear to be an actual alphabet, and that once they understood this, they could actually read it, according to what the translation was. The translation was quite accurate to it. So interesting. But that's not the Book of the Law. The Book of the Law is something different.
And so the Vori plates are a human-made record.
Yes.
And the Book of the Law is a divinely granted document.
Yeah, it actually comes from, the Book of Mormon talks about this Exodus at the time of the Babylonian captivity, when the Jews were captured by the Babylonians and taken away into captivity. But these people were warned and led away and led over to this place as a refuge and to start there. And they took with them what is referred to in the Book of Mormon as the plates of Laban, which were really like the plates of, you might say, the early Israelite Hebrew church, the Ten Commandments and, the different books, the book of Isaiah, anything that they had was contained in these records. But of course, back then, only few copies of those things existed. They weren't common. So they actually had to steal those plates from a guy before they left. And that story is in the Book of Mormon. But supposedly they took the record with them over here. And that's, in fact, the record that they're saying that they had, was buried with the record that the inhabitants had made of their time here. Those plates were buried with it, but they were sealed to not be until James. So you might say they're actually old Hebrew records. That's what the Book of the Law is. The Book of the Law is mentioned in the Old Testament a couple of times. When they come out of their Babylonian captivity and revisit, the first thing they did was they said that they read the Book of the Law in the temple to all the people again for the first time for a long time. So that's the story. I mean, as far as it kind of connects, but it's definitely not anything a lot of people are aware of. So
no, that's not common knowledge.
No.
So then, just to go back to Beaver Island, so James J. Strang is scouting out on more land for, to have a safe place, and how do things go from there?
Things. It's a beautiful place. It's perfect for what they want to do. You can sustain a pretty good population on the island. There's plenty of work to do if you want to do it. They were very industrious. They've started selling firewood to the steamships because it was quicker to stop at the island than it was to go all the way to mainland to get restocked. And the Mormon people that went up there they were farmers, and they were some educated people. They were New Englanders in a lot of ways, and people that had settled in the Midwest. The people up around Beaver Island were much rougher, kind of Irish immigrants, fishermen, but it was not a real, I guess, cultured area of the country. And so there was kind of a culture clash. Those people tended to make their living more so either fishing, or they would buy furs from the Indians. They would trade liquor for furs and things like that. And it was more that kind of what you might find out in the Western territories. So it's kind of the way it was up there. And of course, they did not like these interlopers coming into their area, especially because they started making money, and probably dipping into some of their potential money and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. But so there were hostilities early on, and that's, some of your other questions addresses some of that, so I won't get into it too much. But I'd say the initial thing was that it was a great place to go. It was perfect for what they needed, but it didn't go well. The people just tried to go up there and work, but they were harassed a lot. Initially, it was just harassment, and then it turns to a lot of thievery, and then it turns to violence, and but later on we'll see one of the big things that comes from it is that they're able to put out all kinds of accusations against the Mormons. Like they would publish all this stuff saying, oh, the Mormons are doing this and they're doing that. They're raping and pillaging. And they have a pirate ship. They're going around thieving from everybody. And this was all just to try to get rid of them. Mm-hmm. And ultimately, that campaign of misinformation does work in a lot of ways, which we'll see that re-enter the conversation here with some of these questions.
Yes. Now, Beaver Island is part of Michigan. Yes. And is that where Strang became a legislator?
Yes. Okay. Yeah. He, as when he had residency there, obviously there was a representative from that area for the Michigan legislature, of which he wins the post. And he serves quite a few years in the Michigan legislature with a great deal of notoriety. His fellow legislators thought he was quite bright, very good at writing legislation, and he passed he was behind a lot of things to try to protect the Native American population, because he saw them being exploited, basically, that the cheap Indian whiskey was being traded for, which wasn't even really liquor. It was a pretty bad group of stuff.
Correct me if I'm wrong. Didn't that include like rat poison being used? Yeah,
it had all kinds, anything in it, turpentine and tobacco and you name it. They'd throw anything in there and sell it to them. And so he made it. He tried to get a law to say it was illegal to sell it to him, but that he couldn't get that, because you can't say, well, it's illegal to sell somebody something. If they want to buy it, they want to buy it. Mm-hmm. So what he did is I think he got a law passed to where there was this huge tax put on it, that would try to really slow down their ability, that you might be able to give them this barrel of whiskey for your stuff, but you got to pay this huge tax. And so that they really hated him for that, and several other things. But
he was quite a progressive legislator, wasn't he? I mean, I'm thinking women's rights and anti-slavery, and yes.
Yeah, he was. He was he had a lot of respect down there. There was one of the Detroit newspapers was one of the few publications that were willing to actually say, well, we're actually going to report news. Okay. Our observation is that, and they make a statement, I don't have it in front of me, but they actually in their paper say, as far as our research is done, these people have been accused of all this stuff and none of it's true. And some of that is bore out as history goes on. He was arrested like a dozen times on all kinds of charges. And not one time was he found guilty. There is no evidence of any of it ever being true. Now, if he was really doing all this stuff, sooner or later, somebody's going to have the evidence that he did it, and he's going to wind up in jail.
You would think something would stick, yes.
Something's going to stick if there's any truth to it, but it never does. And the most famous case, really, I guess, will be addressed in one of your later questions about the U.S. government. There's a whole story behind that, which I think also brings out that point. But we can wait with that if you want, or we can
just briefly. Well, could you elaborate for us? What did James J. Strang mean by king, and how did that whole kingdom thing, what does that mean? Well, how did that work?
It's pretty misunderstood, because anytime people in this country or Europeans hear the word king, they think monarchy. You know, that's what a king is. But it wasn't that type of king. If you'd be closer to, say, an Israelite king, King David, King Solomon, blah, blah, blah. It's a governmental appointment. And actually, a lot of people don't know this, but Joseph Smith also had the moniker of king, because it was an appointment of jurisdiction, you might say, that went even in Israel. There was a prophet usually that was kind of the spiritual leader of the people, but then there was a king who was the municipal leader of the people. And seems the Mormons were forming their own communities pretty much. They had their own municipality, of which, if you're Israelite, that may have a king at the head of it at times. And one thing that I think most Christians miss this point, I'm not sure, I can't speak for other religions, but in the New Testament, it's quite clear. Jesus makes it very clear that when you believe in him, you become a Christian, you are grafted into the house of Israel. He talks about the olive branches, the natural olive branches, which are by blood you're in. But those who are converted become grafted into it. So we really are part of the house of Israel. And therefore, certain things like this would be appropriate, even in our own administrations, because that would be something that existed. In other words, if a Jewish group did that, nobody would have thought anything of it. Oh, okay. Well, part of those Hebrew guys,
I think I get your meaning. Yes.
But really, when we take it as a monarchy, establishment of, it doesn't make much sense. But I don't think that enough Christians even understand their own status. If you believe in Christ, then you are grafted into the house of Israel, and you share in that. So,
which is a kingdom.
It is a kingdom, yes. And so, I think that it's been misconstrued because it makes great tabloid fodder and stuff over the years and stuff. So it's been purposely turned into a joke, but it really was just a municipal appointment, more or less. But that's fun.
What would you? I read briefly, not that much, about the Nauvoo Legion. What could you tell us about that?
The Nauvoo Legion was in Nauvoo under Joseph Smith, and they were given a charter. Nauvoo at one time was about the size of Chicago in population. Wow. One of the largest cities in Illinois. And it was given a charter. And in that charter, each city is supposed to have a militia, and so you're given also this whole permission to have a militia that is ultimately under the state rule, but you have to have your militia ready when called. I guess we'd call it the National Guard, but you have to be ready to go if they say, we're going to war against Mexico, so send your militias. And that's what the Nauvoo Legion was, actually. There was no militia on Beaver Island. There were accusations of all kinds of things, but the history shows no militia other than people just trying to defend themselves when they had to, when they're being attacked or whatever. But if there would have been a militia, it probably would have been used at some point, because
sure, yes.
We'll find out later after James is assassinated, a drunken mob comes onto the island and robs everybody at gunpoint of everything and forces them onto ships against their will. If there was a militia, I think there would have been some resistance, I'm pretty sure.
That would make a lot of sense, yes.
Yeah, the absence of any militia would explain why the people just simply they just walked away from their stuff and were forced on boats and left. There was no skirmish, no resistance at all. So I think the idea of a militia, along with a pirate ship and several other accusations of things, never existed. They were not intrinsically designed to be a force, a military force, or a violent force of any sort, but they were accused of it repeatedly. And it made there's some stories, there's still some stories that circulate about Mormon piracy. Well, it became pretty obvious when you'd read the reports. These guys were dressed up like Indians, and they would actually pull ships over and rob the people and stuff like that. And they made a point to tell them that they were Mormons.
That seems rather suspicious that you're big on announcing your identity when you're committing a major crime. Yes.
Oh, they were Mormons. They told us they said they were Mormons. And that's what the newspapers printed. And this starts to cascade a whole set of events that ultimately wind up in James J. Strang's assassination. But those are the types of things we get to eventually here that all contribute to that, is those types of horrendously false reports that weren't true at all. They didn't own any ships. I mean, why was he always taking a ship when he had to go someplace if they had their own ship? None of it adds up. So
I see. Yes. And I've heard some things about horse stealing, horse rustling, and horse rustling on an island seems kind of strange.
Yeah, they were accused of a lot of thievery, but if you read the accounts, most of the time it's one of those things where they, at least from my perspective, I'm sure if you ask the islanders, they would have a different perspective, but that perspective is the only one that's ever existed. We have records of people talking about letters from people that lived on the island, and they said they were being robbed all the time. When they went to the mainland, they could barely go to the post office or do anything because they were harassed, they were robbed. And so what had happened is they might come and steal a bunch of stuff, and a couple months later, some guys would go steal it back. Well, then they're accused of stealing, but they're really trying to steal back what had been taken from them. And so these reports are just a bunch of finger pointing then. Well, no, and they're like, there were some guys on a boat going across, and all of a sudden shots are coming from the mainland, and they're trying to get shot. And so they're trying to escape that, and they shoot. Well, the report goes the other way. The Mormons attacked us from their boat and was shooting. See, and who are you going to believe?
Mm-hmm.
And
a lot of this, it becomes, counter allegations.
It is.
A lot of yellow journalism. Yeah.
It is. And back then, journalism was not held to any standards. And if a report came through from if some newspaper up near Beaver Island wants to say that this is what happened, a newspaper from anywhere in the country can just say, oh, that sounds like a good story. We'll pick that up and we'll run it. You didn't have to prove that it was true. You didn't care. It was like everything was just the National Enquirer,
Mm-hmm.
And it was about subscription, selling stories for subscription. They didn't care if it was true or not. And so this whole thing, this little microcosm was happening around Beaver Island, blew up into a nationally known thing. I mean, this makes it all the way to Washington, D.C. eventually. So,
and that's a hugely inflated version of what was going on.
Going, because this sounds like a great story. Oh, they got pirates now. Now they're robbing people on the high seas, and these made
the high seas of Lake Michigan, yes.
Yes. And so it really does ultimately lead to a far bigger conflict. And we can get into that when we get to that question, or I can go into it now if you want.
Yes, please. How did the U.S. government get involved with all this?
What happens is, as they get all these reports of horrible things, I mean, oh my gosh, you couldn't believe the U.S. government starts saying, what's going on up there? We need to shut this down. They didn't investigate it. They were just believing whatever reports, and these people were really trying to send reports out there as much as they could. And so they basically send a man by the name of Bates, who was a attorney. What do they call it? He works for the Attorney General.
The U.S. Attorney?
Yeah. He was an attorney working for the Attorney General of the United States. So he's U.S. Attorney Bates, and he's given the job to go up there and straighten this Strang guy out. And so he goes up there, and they put him on a big warship, and he blusters in there, and he's pretty ruthless. I mean, he's not there to find justice. He's there to get Strang out because they're buying these reports. Now, like I say, the one newspaper in Detroit was the only one that basically said these reports aren't true, but the feds just wanted it over. And so this guy was pretty heavy-handed. He kidnapped several people that were associated with James and basically threatened to kill him if they wouldn't set him up, to be arrested. They wanted to go, like, he figured, I can't go on Beaver Island. They'll, according to them, they got a militia over there. So he wanted to get these guys to betray him. And he basically told them that if they didn't cooperate, he was going to kill him. And then one guy writes a report. He asked the captain, "You got to be kidding me. You can't really do that to me." And the captain looked at him and said, "I'll do whatever he tells me to do."
Wow.
So the guy's like,
some really heavy-handed intimidation. I mean, it's life or death. Yes.
So he writes a letter to Strang saying, "Look, they're going to kill me if you don't turn yourself in." And now, if Strang was this scoundrel, he would have hijacked it out of there. If he was a flim-flam man, if he was in this for, any other reason than that he was what he said he was, and he knew that these feds wanted to arrest him, this guy told him, "Yeah, you have to turn yours in or they're going to kill me, and they're out to get you." And he just turns himself in. He says, "No, I'm not going to let my friend die." So he turns himself in. And they have this big trial, and this guy's got all kinds of witnesses, people that go in there, and they're going to tell him this, and they're going to tell him. This Attorney General's got this all set up, so he can come back with basically James J. Strang's head on a platter. But lo and behold, the trial goes through, and they find him innocent. Like, there is no actual proof that anything you're saying here is true. And so, and this Attorney General was not happy.
Oh, I would bet not.
Not set good with him. And ultimately, the federal government, I think under Bates's direct, his control, is involved in the plot to kill James, because it's evident. They find a couple of people that were ex-Mormons, you might say, that had an axe to grind with him. And they convinced them to be their dupes. That this one of the guys had been committed adultery on the island. And according to the rules at the time, it was the husband's right to punish him. And the husband said, whip him. So Strang didn't stop him. He didn't order it, but he didn't stop him, and he whipped the guy. So he hates Strang and he hates Mormons now but he knew the rules.
Yeah. Well, and this is this is pre-Civil War America. That was not, out there at all.
No. And so he hates him. And then this other guy, Wentworth, he was a young guy, but he had a thing for Strang's niece. But Wentworth was kind of a sketchy character. He was kind of a kid in trouble a lot with the law, and I think he drank a little bit, and James didn't approve of him. So he basically said, no, I won't allow you to date my niece. So he hates Strang. But that's exactly what McCullough needs, and this Bates guy. They need somebody that they can convince to do the dirty work. And so they set this all up, and this is pretty documented. They get on this warship, the USS Michigan, which was the most powerful warship on all the Great Lakes, brand new, pride of the Navy, and they pull into the harbor.
So they're sending the big guns. They're not playing around here.
Oh no, yeah. And like I say, they sent him up here on a mission to get rid of him, and they pull into the harbor at St. James, and they send a guy out to say, tell James that the captain wants to see him. Okay. And so this is after the trial and all that stuff that Bates lost out on and stuff. And I couldn't tell you if Bates was on the ship or not, but it wouldn't be surprised. I mean, it's a federal ship, so.
Oh, yes. And he traveled that way before, yes.
So he sends a message for James the captain wants to see him, and so James like, okay. So he heads down by himself towards the docks, going to get on the ship. And it just so happened that there was like 6 or 8 soldiers from the ship that happened to kind of be standing in kind of an area where they kind of like were blocking off other people from being around. And James just comes walking down the pier, and these 2 guys jump out from behind a couple of crates or bales of something and shoot him and beat him with their pistols and then run onto the ship. And soldiers go up on the ship, and they're on the ship, and of course the people were witnessing, saw this happen, and they're like, they go and they're like, hey, give those guys to us. I'm the sheriff here on Beaver Island, and we want to incarcerate them. And the captain says, nope, you ain't getting them. And he promptly takes the ship, turns around, heads back to the mainland. They unload the 2 guys. They have a trial instantly. Judge comes, here's the testimony, not guilty.
So a rather kangaroo court, you might say.
Well, they can't be tried then.
Mm-hmm.
It's double indemnity. You can't be
double
tried.
Jeopardy, yes.
So you're charged with killing James A. Strang, and not guilty. So now they're just set free. So all that was complicit with the federal government. I mean, they couldn't have done that without the help of the government. But it all goes back to this attorney general, that was probably really peeved at not being able to actually find any evidence against James A. Strang. That they started this. So it's it's not that different than Joseph Smith, because there was a lot of government help in his, arrest. And if, they knew where they were taking him, they had it all set up for the mob, the Carthage Greys, to be there to kill him and stuff like that. So it seems like the government had a hand in both of them, a pretty deep hand, I would say.
I see. That is absolutely fascinating, and not a view that you find very often. I'm learning things here. By all means.
It's one of those things where, even because so much of these problems were caused by all the lies that were sent, and that's not stopped. That has gone on even since then. Any book written about it all chimes in on it, but the details of his assassination and how they were taken back and let go, that's pretty consistent. Even the people that are trying to smear him can't discount the fact that is what happened. They were let go. The captain.
Yes, no one was ever held accountable for his murder.
No one was ever held accountable for it. So it really was an assassination, and then really within a week or so after that, the drunken mobs hit Beaver Island and forced the people off the island. And they dispersed them indiscriminately along the shores of Lake Michigan, and they even split up families sometimes. And they didn't have any money, and they went as far as Chicago. There was letters of people that were dropped off in Chicago in the middle of the summer. It was super hot, no place to go, no money, and they're just standing there. Where do we go? We don't know anybody. And there was one guy who owned a warehouse, and he saw them, and he's like, he opened his warehouse and let him go in there and stay till they could try to figure something out. And otherwise, nobody, and the church, by doing that, there was no repercussions. There was no one to argue with anybody. The people were dispersed, and they never really got back together very much, only in very small groups. So it's not like they could mount a defense.
No,
they were barely surviving.
Scattered, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, most of them just tried to find any family member that would take them in, because they were destitute. They didn't have anything. And so they were basically just run out of there. And it's like they say, history is told by the victors.
Yes,
and
indeed.
So they were victorious. And so all the stories about Beaver Island and all the stories about James Strang, even to this day, are written based on the viewpoint of the people who run them out. And it's never written from the perspective of the Mormons or who James A. Strang really was. I mean, how he acted as a person, the things he did, the things he taught, nothing. And I think his teachings are the most impressive thing about the man, actually.
Yes, and just to shift gears a little bit, yes, please, let's get into that. What are some of the theology, the belief system, the things that James J. Strang taught that were unique to him?
Well, there's several. I mean, I'll try to mention them briefly, because I know, again, as I looked at this, I said, boy, we could talk days about these questions. But there were things, like some of the things that struck me a lot was, like, for instance, creation. Christian theology has been steeped in a 6-day creation theory and stuff like that. And James said it was revealed to him that it was more like 6 ages. It took a very long time. All creation, even the creation of man, everything was done, as he put it, by successive changes. So it took a very long time for all this to be created, even mankind. And that we don't know the creative process, but that it took very long. See, that's really...
That sounds like evolution, essentially.
I mean, compared to what Christians were thinking back in the 1800s, even today, That was revolutionary.
Oh, yes. And that tracks so close with modern science that it's...
Yeah, exactly. But that's what he taught. You know,
Wow.
that's what was revealed to him, was that it took a very long time, and it was, and so things like that are interesting. And I think you go back and he starts to look at things like the changing of the Sabbath day.
Yes.
Well, how could you change the Sabbath day? That was a perpetual covenant between God and his people. You know, why would it change? Christ didn't keep Sunday. Christ kept Saturday as the Sabbath. And we're supposed to do everything that Christ did. So why would it get changed to Sunday all of a sudden? Well, because that's when the pagans celebrated. You know, that was their high day of worship. And so what we really see Christianity did is it didn't convert pagans. It just meshed the two together so that you couldn't tell the difference almost. Mm-hmm. And one of the key things to that was, of course, the fact that that Sunday was the day you worship the gods. And so it's going to be much easier for us to get these people to, you know, to do this if we just keep the same traditions. And most all the holidays that Christians celebrate are all taken from those pagan holidays. They're just renamed. That's all. Yes. And so that's some of the stuff that he changed it back to the Saturday Sabbath as being correct, you know, that's the only day. I think, let's see. I think the two big things is what constitutes salvation and the identity of who Christ was. I mean, the one important thing you have to understand about Christ is that it was promised to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, all King David. There was a promise given, God's word to them. My promise to you, my covenant with you is that from your loins, your seed, the Savior will come. Okay, gotcha. So if at the last minute, God jumps in there and there is no seed there is no conception from his seed, he just broke his covenant. You know, I mean,
in other words, that Jesus Christ would have to be born as a man, yep. Not the way we get with the Immaculate Conception, but through a literal conception.
Right.
And that he would be the physical son of Joseph.
Joseph was Jesus's father. And oddly enough, if you read in the book of Matthew, just before the story of the virgin birth, the first chapter gives his genealogy, right?
Yes, it does.
And who's the last guy on the list?
Well, it's Joseph. Yes.
Joseph. In the same book, it's giving his genealogy, and Joseph is listed as the last. Why was the genealogy given? Because to the Jews, that was the most important sign of the Savior. So the first thing you're going to do, if you're going to write something to try to convince people that Jesus was the Savior, is you're going to give the genealogy. And it goes down through all of them, and King David, and then here's Joseph, who was of the tribe of David, you know, of Judah, mm-hmm. And from the house of David. That was his genealogy. He's the last person listed there because he was his father.
And if Jesus Christ had been divinely conceived the way that the standard Catholic Christian story goes, there'd be no point in mentioning Joseph because he's basically just a stepfather.
Oh, yeah. Why would he be on the list? If
his biology doesn't matter, but it does matter. And Jesus Christ would have to be born the same way that all humans are born, and then later become the Christ. Go ahead.
Yes, absolutely. Whoever wrote the book of Matthew, the apostles, right afterwards, mm-hmm. said Joseph was his father because he put that list together. That didn't come from the Old Testament. That came from the New Testament. First book of Matthew. There it is. The first thing they do is establish that. And so that's the first big signal. But it even goes, more than that, in that the whole Trinity doctrine is steeped in pagan tradition in a lot of ways, because if you talk to a pagan, they're okay with a demigod, half man, half God. God comes down all the time, virgins. We got Hercules, we got all these guys.
Dionysus, yes, many.
Yeah, we can relate to that. We can relate to that concept. That's a God, okay. But a man is a man and a God is a God. A man can't be God unless God is involved in propagating him. That's pagan thinking, 101 from the beginning. So they had to change that, I think, somehow. They had to make Jesus more divine from the beginning. Now, to me, it doesn't diminish Jesus in the least.
No.
Jesus was a created spirit like the rest of us, but he was the first spirit created. He was the only begotten that the Father alone created. And then together they created all the other spirits that we are now. But he was given that job by the rights of his position to be our Savior. But he had to come down here and prove it. He had to come down and give his life. If he was God, the Father, incarnate, what did he prove? He can't do anything.
You make a fascinating point, yes.
He already knows everything. It's just a mockery to say I suffered because I'm God. I'm not God. But for a man to do this, it shows the utmost faith and the utmost belief in his Father's will, that he came down and lived as a man and still was willing to give up his life and dedicate himself to the will of the Father. If you cannot read the New Testament and come away with the idea of the Trinity. You will only come away with the idea that Jesus was his son, subordinate to him. I can point out hundreds of points in the New Testament where Jesus himself says, my Father is greater than me. I learned, my Father taught me what I know. If I'm already God, how can I be taught? That
becomes kind of a shell game that, yes, you have God talking to God, and that. And
another place.
This makes much more sense.
Yeah. In another place, he says, the day that I come back to earth is not known to man, nor is it known to me. Only my Father knows when I will return. Well, if you are the Father, then you know when you're going to return.
Yes.
He says, even I don't know the day that I will return. I will return when my Father tells me to return. But he did do what he needed to do. He fulfilled his mission. The atonement happened, and he made it possible for all of us to return to heaven through him. But he had to do that as a man. He had to be our go-between between God and man. If he was God, this is just a shell game,
Yes, and that has really impressed me about the Strangite belief system, that so much of the New Testament makes so much more sense if
Absolutely.
Jesus is a man. His prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane, his 40 days of fasting, many things make no sense if he's God incarnated. This doesn't make any sense.
If he's God, why is he saying, God, if there's any way to take this cup from me? If you are God, who are you praying to?
It's kind of a split personality situation that doesn't make a lot of sense. Yes.
Well,
that Strangite has made much more sense to me.
But that is why if you ask somebody about it, they say, well, it's a mystery. Well, it sure is. Yes. It's definitely a mystery, to say the least. So, and yet this is the one tenet of Christianity, that if you don't believe, you're not considered to be a Christian. You have to believe that Christ was God incarnate, and that the Trinity is not three separate people or three separate entities. It's the same entity in three forms. Well, there you can read it a million times, but you'll never find the word or the concept of the Trinity in the Bible. And I asked somebody one time, they said, well, it says right here, Jesus says, my Father and I are one. That's your proof of the Trinity.
Well, that's like, open to interpretation, I would imagine.
Okay, read to the end of the chapter. You read the end of the chapter, and he's pleading with his father for his 12 apostles, and he's telling them, he's asking his father, I want them to be one with me as I am one with you. So what? Now we got 14 gods, because he's telling you what he means by one.
Yes.
He's not meaning they're not in the same person, one in spirit, one in purpose.
Yes.
We're one, we're united. And that's
the body of Christ type of thing, but not literally we're the same entity. No.
Exactly. And you're absolutely right. The New Testament takes on an explosive meaning when you understand the truth about a lot of things concerning it, that where Christianity has taken it, it is difficult to make it work. But it's not, if you understand some of these things, what a wonderful story. It really is. It's just wonderful to read it and understand some of those things.
And that's something that, not to get too theological, but there's always been kind of a gap, at least in my reading of the Bible, between the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, the main commandment, Hear, O Israel, the Lord thy God is one God. And then in Christianity, there's three essentially. And there's a lot of shuffling around of why it's not three, it's really one, but it's three. And
it is. It is
Strangite
different.
Belief is very unique, if I'm not mistaken, within Christianity.
Completely unique in all Christianity, yes. But I wouldn't expect it to be anything else.
True enough.
If it indeed is a restoration, I would not expect it to be the same as all the rest.
And the Salt Lake City LDS has gone full on Trinitarian.
Not Trinitarian. Virgin birth, yes. But Trinitarian, not so much. Only because I think you have to remember, in Joseph Smith's initial encounter, he sees God and Jesus both separate, speaking to him, because he says, the first person who said, "This is my beloved son, hear him." That's the words spoken to him in his initial visit. So I think as far as I know, I've not had an in-depth discussion with any of my Brighamite friends, but I believe they don't accept the Trinity as Christians understand it, at least. So, but they do believe in the virgin birth, which we don't, and the Sunday Sabbaths and a few other things that are basic. But
and I'm not going to try to provoke any inter-Nicene squabble there but it seems kind of like they made a lot of compromises for acceptance.
Yeah, I think when Brigham led the church, and because I'm not a great expert in all their history, but I observe what I know, that he taught a lot of things that weren't consistent with Joseph. Adam God theory, that we're all Adam, we're all going to be gods, we're all evolving gods, and Adam was God, and all this kind of stuff. Those are coming from the same place a lot of other fables come from. What men come up with in their heads and things like that.
Almost a science fiction type of concept.
Yeah. And the church has really tried to distance themselves from those things. In later, more modern times, those things don't fly real well. So they don't really talk about it or teach it that much anymore, because it's not real prudent. But I think the main thing, the Brighamites, to me, I call them Brighamites because we're Strangites, they're Brighamites. It's got, most people are, when I talk to somebody, they're like, "Oh, what? Brighamite?" Okay. I think that for the most part, they have tried very hard to create a society that portrays a lot of the Christian lifestyle and ethic, and they have accomplished that in a great deal. The people are very, very good people. The problem I have with them is that they do too much thinking for the people. They are not free to think for themselves, to venture into other things, to discuss or say, well, what about this? Or what if they did say, why do we keep a Sunday Sabbath? Just because that's, they have a very low tolerance for anybody that shakes the tree. And I don't like that. In the Strangite church, we can have some wild discussions because everybody's free to speak their mind.
It's a very different mentality, yes. It
is. It's a different mentality. Now, we don't always agree about everything, but we always try to say, but at the end, it has to be backed up by scripture. If this thing is going off the rails in some direction and you got no scriptural justification for it, we're probably going to say, yeah, no, we ain't buying that. But there's individually, take something like the word of wisdom about not smoking or coffee and all that kind of stuff. Whereas for them, it's a very controlled thing. I mean, you can't even go in the temple if you drink coffee or something, there's a lot of, we are going to control your behavior or there's a consequence. We're more free agent. I think God protected free agency from the very beginning. Man needed to be free to choose of his own free will what he believes, what he does, how he's judged, and that the original plan was, the right one. We come here to experience good and evil. We have to know the difference. If we don't, we only know good, and therefore we don't know anything. We don't know what good is. It's not compared to anything. So how can we say this is good, or even that I'm happy? How do I know I'm happy? I just am what I am. I'm whatever I was made to be. This earth was necessary for us to come, and free agency was its hallmark. We had to have free agency, and we respect that fact a lot, that people have to be free to choose. And so that's where obviously there's a few doctrinal differences, but the main thing that I wish for, and I have Brighamite friends that who have said, I wish we could be like you guys. I wish we had the freedom to read whatever books we want and, think however we want and challenge something once in a while and say, maybe this or maybe that. But I think that they became afraid of the image that they might put out if their people weren't perfect or whatever. But I think they just lose something in that. There's a genuineness that I think, and I really don't want to make this sound like I'm trying to promote or say something positive about our group, but I have had many people come and they sit through a Sabbath meeting with us and come to our house, and they just say they really enjoy the experience because you guys are real. This isn't a show. This is who you are, and you can tell there's a difference. We're not trying to put on a show as much as we're simply, that's the way we live, and we're not perfect by any means. We have flaws. We make a lot of mistakes. We have to overcome them, and we're not afraid to talk about those flaws and things like that. And I think that's necessary to people to really benefit, to really grow. And it really comes down to, I think, how we look at salvation itself, what salvation really is. And that's a big subject because, you can go look at a lot of different Christian churches, all the way from you're saved by grace, once saved, always saved, which is it's another doctrine. It's not biblical. And you've got other, more strict ones that you have to absolutely serve the church in this way or that way in order to earn your way into heaven that way, or whatever it might be. But at the end of the day, for us, it's simply learning to live by the commandments that Jesus gave, to love your neighbor first of all. Love God, love your neighbor. Everything's based on that. And everything is just an extension of that thought. And I actually, let's look here. I'll read you one paragraph if you want.
Oh, please, go ahead.
This is from the Book of Law. This is one of our most common read things because to me, it kind of encapsulates. James A. Strang wrote this in the notes on the Eucharist. And so it kind of encapsulates how we feel about how we should approach our salvation. And I'll just read this one paragraph. It says, there can be no such thing as a conformity of man to the character of God, which is the true idea of salvation. Conforming our character to the character of God is the true idea of salvation, till with a higher order of wisdom and intelligence and a power of choosing between good and evil, man continually prefers the good and abhors the evil, preferring good to evil, not from the fear of the punishment which evil deeds may entail, but on account of the innate loveliness of undefiled goodness and of pure, unalloyed holiness. That's kind of our definition of what we're here to do, is to simply live the right way and learn to really respect the good and be the good, not because we're afraid of punishing, we're going to go to hell, but because we just love the good things and want to be that way. And I think that's what we focus on as much as we can. James writes in another place that God founded his government on love. That's the big thing. And I, for one, I find a great deal of value in reading people's near-death experiences, because what do they come back and tell us? Hey man, it's about learning it's about whether you learn how to love, and that's exactly our focus. I think that James put us on that course, that is the basis of all things, really, to be learned. And so that really describes in many ways, Jesus is a huge part of that, because without him, I don't think we would even have the opportunity to learn, because he is that go-between. He is that guy who paid the price so that we can repent. He didn't pay the price so we can be a real jerk our whole life and still go to heaven. He paid the price that we can change and it'll be accepted, But he makes many statements in his that not everybody that says, oh, Lord, Lord, is going to definitely make it. But the people who do the will of the Father, that's the people that are going to be able to function in heaven. We also don't believe in people being cast into hell who don't want to be there. James said that basically the only people that ever are cut off from the presence of God completely are those who prefer it, who really don't.
That's a heavy doctrine. And there undoubtedly are some people who would prefer that existence.
There really is. There are people. But other than that, of course, part of Mormonism is understanding that heaven is not just one place. There's degrees of heaven with different particular glories to them, which I would account as abilities or what you're exposed to. That the universe is a very big place. It's a very big place.
Yes, indeed.
And in some of the higher degrees of your development as a spirit, as a being, you may have access to more yet of this universe that you can traverse or understand or be part of than someone who is very base in their thinking. But still in all, there's still a place for them. That the only people who can't have anything to do with God, you might say the truly damned, are those who prefer it. And that's not really true of Christian doctrine,
No, that's very unique, I would say.
Yeah, and yet it's the only way. It's the only way I can look at God and say, you are 100% just. I have never been able to perceive, knowing how, what a big person he really is, how forgiving he is, how loving he is, how much he created us. We're his children. If you had a child and they've been naughty and they're screaming, no, don't throw me out of the plane. I'm sorry, I won't do it again. No, sorry, you're not good enough.
That seems incredibly harsh, but that is doctrine in a lot of places, yes.
Yeah, God's not going to do that. The only people he rejects ultimately, our judgment is more based on really, I think, our own selves. I mean, we dictate that. He's not really like enforcing it. He's just saying, and I think James explains it that way. It's more like, where could I abide and be comfortable with my spiritual understanding? You might think, well, everybody would want to be in the biggest one, right? I'm like, no, I don't think that if you offered some guy's got an 80 IQ, hey, guess what? It's your lucky day. You get it. I'm going to pay your way into Harvard. Really? No, he doesn't want to
It
go.
wouldn't be a good fit, yes.
Yeah, I'm not going to enjoy that experience. So it's really more about us evolving to the greatest extent that we can. And everybody's going to stop at a certain point where that's where they tap out, and how long that progress. We have an eternity to discover where that might be. But he's never going to throw somebody out who has any desire to be there at all, even if it's minute. And that's to me justice. And I know that the scriptures say that God is just. And to me, he's not God unless he is just. And so to me, James explained the only God I can believe in. And truly
that makes a lot of sense. Yes, it does.
Yep.
Wow.
And yet he's the most maligned character I've ever seen. And his theologies are mocked as, because it's all about his claiming he was a king or something. People, my gosh, there's been horrible things written about that man, and for decades. And just recently, there was probably the worst book ever written about him.
Just some sensationalist nonsense that.
Yeah, I equate it like this. If you said, you know what, I am going to write a book about Abraham Lincoln. However, I am only going to interview or use documents that were put out by Southern slave owners.
You'd probably get a very skewed picture, yes.
Lincoln is going to come out looking like a warmonger, an absolute thieving, rotten person that's out to just everything. Why? Because the only people you're basing it on are the people who hated him. They wanted to kill him. But that's who you're going to base your autobiography or your biography on. That's James's. That's what's happened to James. The only people that write books about him are people who want to write books about this weird guy and how bad he was. And they don't even talk about his theology because he was truly an inspired person and very dedicated. He spent most all of his time working as a theologian, trying to, he wasn't perfect. I mean, we are not people who think prophets are perfect. Mm-hmm. They have a job to do. They're human like us. They screw up. He screwed up. Joseph screwed up sometimes. The people under them screwed up a lot, which didn't help things. So it was a very real experience, and there was no perfection in any of it. But what we're left with is still some very inspiring information that gives us a much clearer viewpoint of Christianity, perhaps as it should have been, not as we got it now, or as it's been handed down to us through all these other filters, which I don't trust very much. And that's the beauty of Mormon. I was not born a Mormon. I wasn't even a very religious person at all. But once I was exposed to it, I just saw a great deal of value in what it was. So I don't know.
Well, no, thank you very much, Elder. I've really appreciated your time. This has been some fascinating material. I guess we'll kind of wrap things up here. Is there anything else you'd like to tell the listeners?
Well, there's a lot of things that it can still be covered, but I think we hit the high spots. I think
and we do have to break this off before tomorrow morning, so we should probably.
I looked at it. I said, if we get this in 2 hours, we did good. But no, I think that we've touched on it. I think the things if I wanted people to know, it's that James A. Strang was not the person created by the books that have been written about him and the people that was not his nature. He had his faults, and we can look at those, and that's fine, but he was a man and he didn't do everything correct. He had a temper at times because he was under a lot of scrutiny and pressure from outside people doing very unjust things to him. But overall, I just think that it's too bad that such a beautiful view of life and the hereafter is so sequestered to so few. And I think that's sad in a way,
Yes.
And we're a very small group. I don't know if you even know, but we're basically less than 100 people nationwide that are actually active members in the Strangite Church. But we defy all sociologists that I've known who say, look, there's a rule about this. No group is stagnant. They're either getting bigger or they're disappearing. And that seems to be true of all the Mormon splinter groups follow that basic rule, except the Strangites. We are very strange in that you can go back and look at our general conference. It looks like the same photograph for the last 100 years. About the same number of people, young families, old people. We're not like top heavy with one or the other. We're very balanced. And we seem to survive with this really small number, through decades and generations. And they're like, that's not normal. And I'm like,
I can't think of another group like that, to be very honest.
No, most people are quite shocked. In fact, we've been written off. Most Brighamite people don't even know that a Strangite church even still exists. They're shocked to find out. If you talk to just a rank and file Utah Mormon, they're like, "There's who? Strang? Never heard of them. And who are you?" But we have survived and we've thrived. I mean, we have a nice community here. We have a great church. We have a lot of learning, and we have young families. We have middle-aged people. We have old people. We own a farm. We own a couple other properties and stuff like that. We own where the original settlement was. I live just on the very edge of it here. And we, quite honestly, in this, people can think what you want, but my personal beliefs is that we're being kind of preserved. Like we should be gone by now, but we're not. And I think there's a reason. I think that whatever we are, we're the custodians of something that at some point will mean something. And I don't venture a guess as to what that might be, but as we just discussed, many of our teachings and knowledge of these things are unique only to us. And
indeed.
Yet they're so universal and necessary things, but they're not out there. And we have a website. People can read the Book of the Law online, and they can do that. But still, we just have to just continue what we're doing and try to keep it as pure as possible, and not we don't have a prophet or anything like that, because other Mormon branch offs all created a prophet. Well, you can't create a prophet. If men create a prophet, he's not a prophet. Only God creates prophets. And that's what we believe. So we don't have a prophet. And so we're just here. But I think we're here for a reason. And that's my personal thought. And I don't know if I'll be able to live long enough to know what that purpose is, but you never know.
That is very profound, and I really appreciate that. This has been a fascinating time talking with you. Definitely, I thank you for appearing and giving us a ton of information. I guess we should wrap it up here, but thank you very much.
Absolutely.
This has been The Weird Part. I'm your host, Vincent Trewell. My special guest tonight has been Elder David August of the Strangite Latter-day Saints, Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, Strangite, in Burlington, Wisconsin. Thank you for listening, and good night.
Good night. Well,